Phoebe Carter stood at the cellar door with the iron key in her trembling hand, listening to the muffled screams coming from below. The storm was building outside, thunder shaking the foundation of the grand house on Meeting Street. She had done something that could never be undone, something that would echo through Charleston's whispered histories for generations. In moments, she would vanish into that tempest, leaving behind only her headscarf tied to that very key, and a mystery that no one would ever solve. But how did a woman with nothing, not even her own freedom, manage to disappear so completely that even her ghost seemed afraid to return? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The story of Phoebe Carter begins not with that fateful night in 1842, but 3 years earlier when she first arrived at the Greene household on a sweltering August afternoon. She had been purchased at the slave market on Chalmers Street for $800, a significant sum that reflected her reputation as an excellent house servant. Nathaniel Greene, a wealthy cotton merchant whose fortune had been built on the backs of enslaved labor across 3 plantations, needed someone reliable to manage his Charleston townhouse. His wife had died the previous winter, and the household had fallen into disarray under the management of his elderly housekeeper, a free woman of color named Delilah who had announced her intention to retire. Phoebe arrived with little more than the clothes on her back and a small bundle containing a change of dress, a wooden comb, and a worn Bible that she could not read but treasured nonetheless. She was 26 years old, tall and lean with eyes that seemed to notice everything while revealing nothing. Her previous owner, a tobacco planter from Virginia, had died bankrupt, and his entire estate, including 23 enslaved people, had been sold at auction to settle his debts. Phoebe had been separated from her mother, 2 sisters, and a younger brother in that sale, each sold to different buyers, scattered like seeds in a violent wind to destinations unknown. Nathaniel Greene was a man of approximately 50 years with graying hair swept back from a high forehead and the kind of face that might have been handsome in youth but had hardened into something calculating and cold. He was not known for cruelty in the way some slaveholders were, with public whippings and brutal punishments, but those who knew him understood that his calm demeanor masked something far more dangerous. He collected people the way other men collected fine art or rare books, not with passion but with the cold assessment of assets and their potential value. He studied Phoebe during those first weeks with an attention that made her skin crawl, watching how she moved through rooms, how she interacted with the other enslaved people in the household, how she kept her eyes lowered in his presence but never seemed truly submissive. The greenhouse was a magnificent structure, 3 stories of Charleston gray brick with double piazzas facing south to catch the harbor breeze. It had been built by Nathaniel's grandfather in 1793, constructed by enslaved craftsmen whose names were never recorded but whose skill was evident in every detail. The main floor held a grand parlor, a dining room that could seat 20, a library, and Nathaniel's private study. The second floor contained bedrooms and sitting rooms. The third floor, under the steep roof, was divided into small, stifling chambers where the house servants slept. The kitchen was in a separate building behind the main house, connected by a covered walkway, as was common in Charleston to keep the heat and fire risk away from the living quarters. But it was the cellar that dominated Phoebe's thoughts from the moment she first descended its stone steps. Unlike many Charleston homes that had small storage cellars barely deep enough to stand upright in, the greenhouse cellar was expansive, almost the full footprint of the house above. The ceiling was high enough that a tall man could walk without stooping, supported by thick brick pillars every 12 feet. The walls were lined with wine racks holding hundreds of bottles, some dating back to the previous century. There were shelves of preserved foods, barrels of flour and sugar, crates of imported goods. But there were also things that spoke of darker purposes: heavy chains mounted to the walls in one corner, a wooden structure that Phoebe recognized immediately as a whipping post, though it was partially hidden behind stacked crates, and a small cell with iron bars that Nathaniel claimed had been used during the Revolutionary War to hold British prisoners. The cellar had only one entrance, a heavy oak door at the top of the stone steps reinforced with iron bands and fitted with a lock so substantial that the key weighed nearly a pound. Nathaniel kept that key on a ring with several others hanging in his study, though he would give it to Phoebe when he needed her to fetch wine for dinner or retrieve supplies. He made a point of watching her return it always, and once he had asked her in a voice like honey poured over broken glass whether she had ever thought about what might happen if someone were trapped down there with the door locked from the outside. Phoebe had been in Charleston for 3 months when she first met Marcus. He belonged to the Rutledge family next door, a coachman and handyman who was sometimes hired out to do repairs for the Greene household. He was perhaps 30 years old, strongly built from years of physical labor, with a quick smile that seemed startling in a world so determined to crush any joy from enslaved people. They met while Phoebe was shaking dust from rugs in the side yard and Marcus was repairing a section of fence that separated the two properties. Their first conversation was brief, careful, both of them aware that even the simple act of speaking to each other without permission could result in punishment. But over the following months they found ways to steal moments together. A few words exchanged when Phoebe was sent to the market, and Marcus happened to be driving his master's carriage in the same direction. Brief conversations in the evening shadows when Marcus came to make repairs and managed to linger longer than necessary. They spoke in whispers and half-sentences, developing a language of glances and small gestures that could communicate volumes while appearing to say nothing at all. Marcus told her about his mother who had died 5 years earlier, about the wife he had been forced to leave behind when he was sold away from a plantation in the Low Country, about a daughter he had never met because she was born after he was taken away. Phoebe, who had learned early that revealing too much of yourself was a form of vulnerability she could not afford, found herself gradually opening the sealed compartments of her heart. She told Marcus about her sisters, about the way her younger brother would sing while they worked in the tobacco fields, about her mother's hands permanently stained dark from years of handling tobacco leaves. She told him about the night of the auction, how they had held each other until the moment the buyers literally tore them apart, how her mother's last words to her had been, "Remember who you are." She told him these things in fragments, offering them up like precious stones she was afraid to lose but could not bear to keep hidden any longer. It was Marcus who first noticed the changes in Nathaniel Greene's behavior toward Phoebe. The way the master's eyes would follow her across a room, the way he would manufacture reasons for her to come to his study, the way he had begun insisting that she alone should serve his wine at dinner, even when he entertained guests. Marcus had seen this pattern before, had watched other men with power do the same dance before they decided to take what they wanted. He warned Phoebe, urged her to be careful, told her stories of women who had resisted and paid terrible prices, but Phoebe already knew. She had felt the danger circling closer for months, like a storm building slow and inevitable on the horizon. Nathaniel had not touched her yet, but she knew it was only a matter of time. She had seen the way he looked at her hands when she poured his wine, had caught him standing in the doorway of the kitchen watching her work, had woken one night to find him at the top of the stairs to the 3rd floor, though he claimed he had only been checking to see if the house was secure. She understood with absolute clarity that he was savoring the anticipation, drawing out the moment before he would claim what he had convinced himself he had every right to take. Winter arrived in Charleston with unusual fury that year. The winter of 1841 to 1842 was one of the coldest on record, with frost killing tender plants and ice forming in shallow puddles on streets accustomed only to rain. The harbor waters turned gray and choppy, and ships delayed their departures waiting for weather to improve. Inside the greenhouse, fires burned in every hearth, and still the cold seemed to seep through the old walls. Nathaniel's temper grew shorter as his joints ached from the damp, and he increased his evening consumption of wine to levels that concerned even the house servants who were used to their masters drinking. It was during this frozen season that Phoebe began making her plans, though she did not yet fully understand what form they would take. She began paying closer attention to Nathaniel's routines, noting which nights he drank more heavily, which evenings he entertained guests, and which he spent alone brooding in his study. She studied the layout of the house with new eyes, counting steps from one room to another, testing which floorboards creaked and which doors had hinges that needed oil. She learned to move through the house like a ghost, present when needed but otherwise invisible, gathering information the way other people gathered kindling for a fire. She also began spending more time in the cellar. Nathaniel sent her down there frequently during the winter months to retrieve bottles of wine, and she would take a few extra minutes each time, exploring the shadowy spaces, learning where every crate and barrel was positioned, memorizing the distances between the pillars that supported the floor above. She found the old punishment corner that Nathaniel had shown her on her first day. Those chains still mounted to the wall, rust scaling off in places where dampness had eaten away at the iron. She wondered how many people had been shackled there over the years, how many had screamed in that darkness with no one to hear them or care. One evening in late January, Nathaniel called Phoebe to his study after dinner. He was alone, which was unusual for that time of night when he typically had friends over for cards and brandy. He told her to close the door, and her heart began racing so hard she feared he would hear it. He poured himself another glass of wine and studied her for a long moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. Then he said he had been thinking about her situation, about how she must miss having family, how lonely it must be to be so far from everything she had known. His voice was soft, almost kind, which made it all the more horrifying because Phoebe understood this was the prelude to demands that would be dressed up as generosity. He told her that he had been considering purchasing one of her sisters, perhaps bringing her to Charleston to work in the household. He said he knew which plantation had purchased the younger one, a girl of about 17 now, and that he had connections with the owner. It would cost him a considerable sum, over $1,000, but he was willing to make that investment. He paused then, letting the implication hang in the air between them like smoke. She would owe him for this kindness. She would be expected to show appropriate gratitude. Her sister's fate, whether she lived nearby or remained forever lost, would depend on Phoebe's compliance. Phoebe stood perfectly still during this speech, her face a mask that revealed nothing. Inside, her mind was screaming, racing through possibilities and consequences. She knew this was a lie, or at best a manipulation so twisted it amounted to the same thing. Even if Nathaniel did purchase her sister, it would only mean two people trapped under his control instead of one. The debt he was creating was not one that could ever be repaid, only one that would grow and grow until it consumed everything she was. She thanked him in a voice that barely trembled, said she would be honored if he brought her sister to Charleston, that she was deeply grateful for his consideration. He smiled then, satisfied, and dismissed her with a wave of his hand that promised he would claim his payment soon. Phoebe did not sleep that night. She lay on her narrow bed in the stifling attic room she shared with two other house servants, listening to their breathing, staring at the dark ceiling, and feeling something fundamental shift inside her. Fear was still there, sharp and cold, but it was joined now by a fury so pure it seemed to burn. She thought about her mother's last words, "Remember who you are," and understood them in a new way. She was not the possession Nathaniel Greene believed he had purchased. She was not an object to be used and discarded. She was Phoebe Carter, and she would not be unmade by this man's desires. The next morning she sought out Marcus at the first opportunity. He was in the Rutledge stable brushing down the carriage horses, and she slipped inside with a basket of kitchen scraps for the animals. A plausible excuse if anyone questioned her presence. She told him what Nathaniel had said and watched Marcus's face darken with anger and helplessness. He wanted to tell her to run, to escape somehow, but they both knew the reality. A runaway slave would be hunted with dogs and violence. If caught, and they were almost always caught, the punishment would be public and brutal, designed to terrify others into compliance. And even if by some miracle she made it north, she would spend the rest of her life looking over her shoulder, never safe, never free, always one betrayal away from being dragged back in chains. They stood close together in the dim stable, speaking in voices barely above a whisper. And Marcus held her hand in a way that was both comforting and heartbreaking. He told her he wished he could protect her, wished he could take her somewhere safe, wished the world was anything other than what it was. Phoebe squeezed his hand and said she knew that his caring meant more than he could imagine, that in another life, in another world, things might have been different for them both. They stayed like that for as long as they dared, drawing strength from each other, before Phoebe had to return to the house and the demands of a day that felt like walking through water, everything thick and strange and difficult. February arrived with slightly warmer temperatures but an increase in rain. The streets of Charleston turned to mud, and residents picked their way carefully along the wooden sidewalks or risked ruining their shoes. Nathaniel's social calendar resumed its usual pace, with dinner parties every few nights where he entertained the other wealthy men of Charleston's merchant class. These evenings required extensive preparation, the house scrubbed until it gleamed, elaborate meals prepared in the kitchen house, the dining table set with china and crystal that had been in the Greene family for 3 generations. Phoebe's role during these dinners was to serve the wine, moving silently around the table, refilling glasses as the men talked business and politics. She heard things during these evenings that the speakers would have been shocked to know she understood. Discussions of cotton prices and slave markets, debates about the growing tensions with Northern abolitionists, speculation about whether the uneasy peace over slavery could hold, or whether the nation was drifting towards something catastrophic. They spoke as if she were not there, or as if she were no more capable of comprehension than the furniture, and she used their blindness to learn things that might prove useful. One evening in mid-February, a man named William Blackwood attended one of Nathaniel's dinners. He was a lawyer, successful and ruthless, known for winning cases that other attorneys would not touch. He was also known, though only in whispers among the enslaved community, for his treatment of the people he owned. 2 women who had worked in his household had disappeared under mysterious circumstances over the years. One was said to have run away, though no one believed it. The other had officially died of fever, though the timing was suspicious, and the doctor who signed the death certificate was known to be flexible with the truth when paid sufficiently. Blackwood spent much of the evening watching Phoebe as she moved around the table. His attention was different from Nathaniel's, less calculated and more openly predatory. At one point he asked Nathaniel where he had acquired such an elegant servant, and Nathaniel answered with obvious pride, explaining the auction, the price paid, Phoebe's many skills. Blackwood wondered aloud whether Nathaniel might consider selling her, and Nathaniel laughed and said not for any price, that she was far too valuable to part with. The other men at the table joked and made comments that caused them all to laugh in the way wealthy men laugh at things that cost them nothing while costing others everything. Phoebe kept her face neutral, her hands steady as she poured wine. But inside she was cataloging every word, every look, every subtle shift in the dynamics of power around that table. These men, she understood, thought themselves untouchable. They had built a world where they made the rules and faced no consequences for breaking them. They had convinced themselves that the people they enslaved were not fully human, which allowed them to commit acts of cruelty and violation without troubling their consciences. And they had surrounded themselves with laws and customs and violence that ensured their power could not be challenged, or so they believed. After the dinner guests had departed and the house had settled into the quiet hours past midnight, Nathaniel summoned Phoebe to his study again. She had been expecting this, had steeled herself for it, but still her stomach clenched with dread as she climbed the stairs and knocked softly on the study door. He called for her to enter, and she found him standing by the window overlooking the street, a glass of brandy in his hand. He did not turn to look at her immediately, and when he finally did, his expression was unreadable. He told her that he had noticed William Blackwood's interest in her, and that it had reminded him of her value as a piece of property. He said that men would pay a great deal to own someone like her, beautiful and skilled, and that he could make a considerable profit if he chose to sell her. He let that threat hang in the air for a moment before saying that of course he had no intention of selling her, that she belonged here in his household, that he had plans for her. He moved closer as he spoke, near enough that she could smell the brandy and cigar smoke on his breath, and he reached out to touch her face in a gesture that was both possessive and threatening. Phoebe forced herself not to recoil, not to show any reaction at all. She thanked him for his kindness in keeping her, said she was grateful to remain in his service. He smiled at that, satisfied by her apparent submission, and told her she could go. As she turned to leave, he added one more thing, his voice casual but laden with meaning. He said that he had written to the plantation that held her sister, and that negotiations for her purchase were proceeding. He expected those negotiations to conclude soon, perhaps within a few weeks. He wanted Phoebe to understand the magnitude of what he was doing for her, the depth of her obligation to him. Phoebe returned to her attic room and lay awake until dawn, her mind working through scenarios and possibilities. She knew with absolute certainty that Nathaniel would not wait much longer before forcing himself on her. The dinner party, Blackwood's interest, the reminder of what she could lose if she resisted, all of it was building toward a moment that was rapidly approaching. She also knew that once he violated her, there would be no going back. The violation would continue night after night until she either broke completely or found a way to end it. And the threat of her sister, whether real or fabricated, would be a chain around her neck for the rest of her life. In the gray light of early morning, Phoebe made her decision. She did not know yet exactly how she would do it, but she knew with perfect clarity what needed to happen. Nathaniel Greene had to be stopped, and she was the only one who could stop him. It would likely cost her everything, her life included, but some things were worth dying for. Dignity was one of them. The refusal to be broken was another. And the determination that he would not have the chance to bring her sister into this nightmare was perhaps the most important of all. She began her preparations that very day, moving with a purposefulness that might have alarmed someone paying close attention. But the other servants were too absorbed in their own survival to notice the subtle changes in Phoebe's behavior. She started gathering small items that might prove useful. A length of rope found in the carriage house, a knife from the kitchen that she hid in her room, a tinderbox she took from the shelf in the cellar during one of her trips down there. She also began eating less at meals, saving portions of her food wrapped in cloth and hidden in her room, building up a small store in case she needed to survive for a period without access to the kitchen. Most importantly, she paid even closer attention to Nathaniel's movements and moods. She noted that he always drank more heavily on Wednesday and Saturday evenings. She observed that he had established a pattern of working late in his study on Wednesday nights, sending the other servants to bed early while he reviewed his business accounts and correspondence. She realized that Wednesday nights offered the best opportunity for what she had in mind, when the house was quiet and she might have an excuse to be near his study without raising immediate suspicion. She also spent time studying the cellar more carefully during her regular trips to fetch wine. She had discovered that there was a small window at ground level on the west side of the cellar, too narrow for a person to fit through but large enough to provide minimal light during daytime hours and, more importantly, fresh air circulation. She had found an old blanket tucked behind some crates, musty but still intact. She had noted the locations of all the wine racks, identifying which ones were sturdiest and which areas of the cellar offered the most concealment. She was preparing for something, though the exact shape of her plan was still forming in her mind like an image slowly developing. On a Tuesday evening in late February, Marcus managed to speak with Phoebe briefly when he came to repair a broken shutter on the second floor. He could see something had changed in her, a resolve that frightened him even as he understood it. He asked her quietly what she was planning, and she told him it was better if he did not know. If he did not know, he could not be implicated. If he did not know, he could not be forced to betray her under interrogation. He argued that he wanted to help, to do something, but she shook her head and said the greatest help he could give her was to survive, to remember her, to tell her story if the chance ever came. They stood in the narrow hallway outside the room with the broken shutter, and Marcus pulled her close for just a moment, a brief embrace that could have cost them both dearly if anyone had seen. He whispered that he loved her, words he had never dared to speak aloud before, and she whispered back that she knew, that she felt the same, that in a just world they might have had a life together. Then she pulled away and returned downstairs before the absence of either of them could be noticed and questioned. The following Wednesday evening, March 2nd, 1842, proceeded like any other. Nathaniel entertained no guests that night, instead spending the evening hours in his study with his account books and business correspondence. He sent the other house servants to bed at 9 o'clock, but asked Phoebe to remain available in case he needed anything. This was not unusual, but Phoebe felt the weight of it differently tonight, understanding what it meant. He was preparing to make his move, establishing the circumstances that would allow him to summon her to his study with no witnesses, no one to hear whatever happened next. At 10 o'clock he called for her. His voice echoed up the stairs, commanding but not loud, the voice of a man who had never doubted his right to be obeyed. Phoebe descended from her attic room, moving slowly, her heart hammering so hard she felt dizzy. She had prepared as much as she could. The rope and knife were hidden under her apron. The key to the cellar hung in Nathaniel's study where it always did, and she had oiled the hinges of the cellar door that afternoon so it would swing silently. She had said a prayer, though she was not certain anyone was listening, asking for strength and forgiveness for what she was about to do. She knocked on the study door and waited for his command to enter. When she stepped inside, she found him standing by his desk, his coat removed and his shirt partially unbuttoned. There was a bottle of wine on the desk, half empty, and 2 glasses, though only one had been used. The implication was clear and brutal in its confidence. He smiled at her and said he thought they should have a conversation about her future, about her sister, about the arrangements he expected her to understand. He gestured toward the empty wine glass and suggested she might want to join him in a drink, to celebrate the good fortune that was coming her way. Phoebe moved into the room, every sense heightened, feeling as though she were watching herself from a distance. She said that she would be honored to share a drink with him, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. She added that she had noticed earlier that afternoon that he was running low on the particular wine he seemed to prefer lately, and that there were several cases of it in the cellar. Perhaps she should fetch a fresh bottle for this special occasion. She kept her eyes lowered as she said this, playing the role of the submissive servant perfectly, and she felt rather than saw his satisfaction with her apparent acceptance of the situation. Nathaniel agreed that a better wine would be appropriate, and he took the heavy key ring from its hook on the wall and selected the cellar key. He handed it to her with instructions to bring up 2 bottles of the French red on the 3rd rack from the front. As she turned to leave, he added that she should not take too long, that he would be waiting for her, that they had important matters to discuss upon her return. The way he said it left no doubt about his intentions, and Phoebe nodded her understanding and left the study. She descended the main stairs to the 1st floor, then crossed through the dining room to the door that led down to the cellar. The house was silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the front hall and the distant sound of wind beginning to pick up outside. She unlocked the cellar door and pushed it open, the hinges swinging silently thanks to the oil she had applied. The stone steps descended into darkness, and she took a candle from the sconce in the dining room to light her way. Phoebe descended into the cellar, her shadow dancing on the brick walls as the candle flickered. She moved to the wine racks as instructed and selected 2 bottles of the French red, setting them on a nearby crate. Then she stood in the center of the cellar, breathing deeply, preparing herself for what came next. She had perhaps 10 minutes before Nathaniel would grow impatient and wonder what was taking her so long. She needed to be ready. She removed the rope and knife from under her apron and hid them behind one of the brick pillars, positioning them where she could reach them quickly if needed. She took the old blanket she had found on her previous visits and draped it over some crates in the darkest corner of the cellar, creating a space where someone could potentially hide if they were desperate enough. She checked the small window at ground level, confirming that it was not locked, though it was far too narrow for escape. Then she picked up the 2 wine bottles and returned to the stone steps. But instead of climbing back up to the dining room, she called up the stairs in a voice that sounded worried and confused. She said she thought she had heard something down here, a scratching sound like rats in the walls, and could Master Greene please come down to investigate because she was frightened to go deeper into the cellar alone. She made her voice tremble just slightly, playing on his perception of her as a woman who would naturally be afraid of dark spaces and vermin, waiting to see if he would take the bait. For a long moment there was silence, and Phoebe wondered if she had miscalculated, if he would simply order her to come back up or to stop being foolish. But then she heard his footsteps crossing the dining room floor, heard him muttering something about women and their fears. He appeared at the top of the stone steps, another candle in his hand, his expression annoyed but also slightly amused. He descended the steps, asking where exactly she had heard this sound, saying he did not hear any rats. Phoebe moved deeper into the cellar, away from the stairs, drawing him down and away from the door. She pointed toward the back wall where the old chains were mounted and said the sound had come from there behind the stored crates. Nathaniel followed, his attention diverted now to the investigation of the supposed rats, his back partially to the stairs. This was the moment, the brief window of opportunity, and Phoebe moved with a speed and determination that surprised even herself. She ran for the stone steps, her feet light and quick on the dirt floor of the cellar. She heard Nathaniel shout behind her, heard him realize what she was doing and start after her. But she was younger and faster and driven by pure survival instinct. She flew up the steps and through the door, then threw her weight against it, slamming it shut just as Nathaniel reached it from the other side. The heavy oak door crashed into place with a sound like a thunderclap, and Phoebe fumbled with the massive key, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped it, finally managing to turn it in the lock just as Nathaniel began pounding on the door from below. The sound of his fists hammering against the oak was enormous in the quiet house, and Phoebe stepped back from the door, breathing in great gasps, hardly believing what she had done. From below she heard his voice, no longer smooth and controlled but raw with fury, demanding that she open the door immediately, threatening punishment so severe she could not even imagine them. His shouts echoed up through the floorboards, and Phoebe knew that if any of the other servants were still awake, they would have heard the commotion. She had perhaps minutes before someone came to investigate. Phoebe stood frozen for a heartbeat, then moved into action with the same focused intensity that had carried her through the past few minutes. She returned to the study and gathered several items. A leather satchel that she filled with some of Nathaniel's money, perhaps $200 in notes and coins from his desk drawer. A warm coat that had belonged to his late wife hanging in a wardrobe in the adjoining bedroom. A pair of sturdy boots that were too large but better than her worn house slippers. She also took the entire key ring from the wall. Not just the cellar key, but all of his keys, preventing anyone from easily accessing that door even if they found the courage to try. From her attic room she retrieved the small bundle of her personal possessions, the wooden comb and the Bible, and the small store of food she had been hoarding. She wrapped these together with several items of clothing and tied the bundle tight. From the kitchen house she took more food, bread and cheese and dried meat, enough to sustain her for several days if she was careful. All of this she did with the sound of Nathaniel's shouts and pounding echoing through the house like the voice of a demon trapped in hell. As she moved through the house for the last time, Phoebe felt a strange sense of calm settling over her. The terror was still there, but it was joined now by something else, a kind of fierce joy in having seized control of her own fate, even if only for this brief moment. She thought of Marcus and wished she could say goodbye properly. But there was no time, and she could not risk implicating him in what she had done. She thought of her mother and sisters, wondering if she would ever see them again, knowing the answer was almost certainly no. She thought of all the enslaved people still trapped in houses like this throughout Charleston, throughout the South, throughout the nation, and she hoped that somehow her action might mean something, might be a crack in the edifice of that monstrous system. She returned to the cellar door one final time. Nathaniel's shouts had taken on a hoarse quality, his voice breaking from the effort, but his fury had not diminished. If anything, it had intensified as he realized that Phoebe was not simply going to unlock the door after a few minutes, that this was not some brief act of defiance, but something far more calculated and final. He was screaming threats now, promising that he would hunt her down, that he would see her hanged or worse, that she would pay for this betrayal with every remaining day of her life, however long or short that might be. Phoebe removed her headscarf, the piece of blue cloth that she had worn every day since arriving in Charleston, and carefully tied it to the cellar key. She laid both on the floor directly in front of the cellar door where they could not possibly be missed. This was her signature, her declaration, her way of saying that Phoebe Carter had been here and had made a choice that no one could take away from her. Then she turned and walked through the house for the last time, passing through rooms where she had worked and suffered, and out into the stormy night that had been building all evening. The weather had deteriorated dramatically while Phoebe had been enacting her plan inside the house. What had been a breezy evening had transformed into the leading edge of a significant storm, with wind gusting hard enough to rattle shutters and tear loose shingles from roofs. Rain was beginning to fall, large drops that struck like pebbles, and the sky above Charleston was a roiling mass of black clouds illuminated periodically by lightning. The storm had come in from the Atlantic with unusual speed, and those who studied such things would later say it was one of the most violent tempests to strike the Carolina coast in a generation. Phoebe pulled the too large coat tight around her shoulders and stepped into the teeth of that storm, her bundle clutched against her chest. She had no clear destination in mind beyond a way, beyond anywhere but here, beyond the reach of Nathaniel Greene and everything he represented. The streets of Charleston were deserted, everyone sensible having taken shelter before the full force of the storm arrived. She walked quickly through the darkness, her feet splashing through puddles that were rapidly becoming rivers of mud, the wind threatening to knock her off balance. She made her way toward the harbor, moving through streets she knew from errands and market trips, navigating by lightning flashes and the occasional light in a window. The rain intensified until it was like walking through a waterfall, soaking through the coat and her clothing beneath, plastering her hair to her skull. Thunder crashed overhead so loud it seemed the sky was tearing itself apart, and the wind shrieked through the narrow spaces between buildings like a living thing in pain. At the waterfront, Phoebe found chaos. Ships strained at their moorings, masts swaying dangerously as captains and crews worked frantically to secure vessels against the storm. Smaller boats had been pulled up onto the docks, overturned to prevent them from being swamped or torn loose. Cargo crates that had not been properly stowed were tumbling in the wind, and the water of the harbor was a churning mass of whitecaps and spray, waves slamming against the pilings with enough force to shake the wooden structures. Phoebe moved along the waterfront, staying in the shadows, watching the activity with desperate hope. She was looking for any opportunity, any vessel that might offer escape, though she had no clear plan for how to accomplish such a thing. She had never been on a ship in her life, had no knowledge of sailing or navigation, and possessed nothing that might convince a captain to take her aboard except the money she had stolen from Nathaniel's desk. But desperation makes people contemplate impossible things, and Phoebe was beyond desperate now. She was transformed into something else entirely, something that refused to accept that her options had narrowed to capture or death. She watched a crew of sailors struggling to secure barrels that had broken loose from their lashings, saw a captain shouting orders that were torn away by the wind before they could be properly heard, observed the general pandemonium of a port trying to survive a storm that had come up too quickly for proper preparation. And in that chaos she saw possibility. Not escape on a ship, that was clearly impossible with crews focused entirely on survival rather than departure, but perhaps concealment. A place to hide until the immediate search for her had passed, until she could formulate a better plan or at least have time to think beyond the next few minutes. She moved further along the waterfront, away from the busiest sections where crews were working, toward the older docks where smaller vessels and fishing boats were kept. Here the storm had already done significant damage, with one dock partially collapsed and several boats torn free of their moorings and smashed against the pilings. The destruction was terrible, representing the financial ruin of the fishermen who depended on those vessels. But it also meant this area was deserted, everyone having fled to save themselves rather than watch their livelihoods be destroyed. Phoebe found a damaged warehouse, its door hanging at an angle from broken hinges, and she slipped inside. The interior was dark and reeked of fish and salt and rot, but it was marginally drier than outside and offered at least temporary shelter. She could hear the storm hammering against the walls, could feel the whole structure shuddering with each gust of wind, and she wondered if the building would survive the night or if she would be crushed when it finally gave way. But she was so exhausted, so overwhelmed by what she had done and what still lay ahead, that she simply sank down onto the floor in a corner and pulled her soaked bundle against her chest like a talisman. She did not sleep, could not have slept even if she had wanted to. But she entered a kind of fugue state where time seemed to stop having meaning. She listened to the storm, to the crash of waves and the shriek of wind and the groan of stressed wood. She thought about Nathaniel locked in his cellar, whether he was still shouting or whether exhaustion had finally forced him into silence. She wondered how long it would be before someone found him, before the alarm was raised. before the search for her began in earnest. She thought about Marcus and hoped he would not be punished for her actions, hoped he would understand why she had not told him goodbye, hoped he would survive in a world that was designed to break people like them. As the night wore on, the storm reached its peak intensity. The wind became so powerful that it seemed impossible anything could stand against it. And Phoebe heard crashes and screams in the distance as structures failed and debris became deadly projectiles. The rain was so heavy that water began seeping through every crack in the warehouse walls until Phoebe was sitting in a puddle that grew deeper by the minute. Lightning struck something nearby, the flash so bright it was visible even through the closed shutters of the warehouse, followed immediately by thunder that felt like being inside an explosion. The whole world seemed to be coming apart, dissolving into primal chaos, and Phoebe felt oddly appropriate that her personal apocalypse was occurring during an actual one. But storms, even terrible ones, do not last forever. Gradually, over the course of hours that felt like days, the fury began to abate. The wind lessened from a shriek to a howl to a moan. The rain decreased from a deluge to a downpour to a steady drumming. The lightning moved further away, the time between flash and thunder increasing, the storm moving inland to terrorize other communities. By the time gray dawn light began filtering through cracks in the warehouse walls, the storm had largely passed, leaving behind the kind of eerie stillness that follows great violence. Phoebe emerged from the warehouse into a transformed city. Charleston had been battered. With debris scattered everywhere, trees uprooted, roofs torn away, shutters ripped from windows. The streets were rivers of mud and standing water littered with broken boards and shingles and branches and things that had once been important to someone but were now just wreckage. The waterfront had suffered catastrophically, with several docks completely destroyed and boats piled against the remaining structures like kindling. The scope of the destruction was almost incomprehensible, representing losses that would take months or years to fully calculate and repair. But for Phoebe, the destruction was also opportunity. In the chaos of storm aftermath, with everyone focused on damage assessment and rescue efforts, one runaway slave woman might be able to move with less chance of immediate detection. The normal routines and patterns that governed Charleston life had been disrupted, creating temporary gaps in the surveillance system that kept enslaved people controlled. She knew this advantage would not last long, perhaps only hours or at most a day or two, but she intended to use every second of it. She made her way back toward the central part of the city, moving carefully through the debris-strewn streets, trying to look purposeful rather than furtive. She passed other people, both white and black, all of them absorbed in assessing damage or helping with rescue efforts, and no one paid her particular attention. She was just another person in a city full of people dealing with catastrophe, and her relative invisibility felt like a small miracle even as she knew it could evaporate at any moment. By mid-morning, Phoebe had made her way to a neighborhood several blocks from the greenhouse, an area that had suffered moderate damage but nothing catastrophic. She found herself near a church, a modest white-painted structure with a bell tower that had lost several of its shingles but was otherwise intact. The church doors were open and she could see people inside organizing relief efforts, gathering supplies for those whose homes had been destroyed. Acting on instinct more than plan, Phoebe approached the church and offered to help, presenting herself as someone displaced by the storm and eager to be useful. The woman coordinating the relief effort, a middle-aged white woman with kind eyes and an exhausted expression, looked Phoebe up and down briefly before nodding and assigning her to help sort donated clothing. It was that simple, that easy, at least for the moment. Phoebe worked alongside other volunteers, black and white, free and enslaved, all of them too focused on the urgent needs of the present to ask many questions about who belonged where. She kept her head down and her hands busy, and she listened to the conversations swirling around her, gathering information about the extent of the storm damage and, More importantly, whether there was any word about a runaway slave from the Greene household. By afternoon, the news began to spread. Someone had finally found Nathaniel Greene locked in his cellar, dehydrated and hoarse from shouting, but otherwise unharmed. The story was already taking on elements of scandal and dark humor that would only grow in the retelling. A slave woman had locked her master in his own cellar and vanished in the storm, taking his money and some possessions, leaving behind only her headscarf tied to the key like a taunt. Some people expressed outrage at such defiance, insisting the woman must be caught and made an example of. Others, particularly among the enslaved and free black population, spoke of it in whispers and carefully neutral tones that barely concealed their satisfaction at seeing a master humiliated. Phoebe continued working at the church, her heart racing every time someone mentioned the Greene household or described the runaway slave woman. But the descriptions were vague, just that she was tall and had worked as a house servant, details that could fit dozens of women in Charleston. No one had mentioned her name, at least not in Phoebe's hearing, and no one had circulated a detailed description or offered a reward yet. Nathaniel was apparently too humiliated and too angry to think clearly about the mechanics of recapture. Or perhaps the storm damage was occupying authorities who would normally have immediately organized a search. As evening approached, the woman who had first allowed Phoebe to volunteer approached her and asked if she had somewhere to stay. Phoebe said honestly that her housing had been damaged in the storm and she was uncertain where she would sleep tonight. The woman considered for a moment, then offered that Phoebe could stay in the church basement for a few days while she figured out her situation in exchange for continuing to help with relief work. It was not much, but it was shelter and temporary safety, and Phoebe accepted with gratitude that was entirely genuine. That night, lying on a pallet in the church basement surrounded by other people who had been displaced by the storm, Phoebe allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she had done and what lay ahead. She had escaped immediate capture, but she was far from safe. Charleston was not large, and the community of free black people was small and closely monitored. She could not stay here indefinitely without papers proving her free status, which she did not have and could not obtain. She would need to leave the city, somehow make her way north or west, find passage on a ship or join a group traveling overland, navigate the hundreds of miles between Charleston and any place that might offer real freedom. The odds against success were staggering. Most runaway slaves were caught within days or weeks, returned to their owners for punishment that served as public theater designed to terrify others into compliance. Those who evaded immediate capture often survived only a short time on their own before starvation or exposure or simple bad luck ended their flight. The very few who made it to northern states or to free territories discovered that freedom was a complicated thing, that racism and discrimination followed them even to places where slavery was illegal, that they would spend the rest of their lives looking over their shoulders for slave catchers who might drag them back south. But Phoebe had already decided that she would rather die trying to be free than live in bondage. She had crossed a line when she locked that cellar door, had become someone who refused to accept the world as it was presented to her, and there was no going back from that transformation. She would run as far and as long as she could, would use every ounce of intelligence and strength and will to survive, and if she ultimately failed, at least she would fail on her own terms rather than Nathaniel Greene's. Over the next several days, Phoebe continued working at the church relief effort, slowly gathering resources and information. She learned which roads out of Charleston had suffered the least storm damage and were most passable. She heard about a group of free black families planning to travel to Columbia in the coming weeks, needing to check on relatives who lived there. She discovered that the port was resuming operations more quickly than expected, with several ships preparing to depart for northern cities within the week. Each piece of information was filed away, considered, evaluated for its potential usefulness. She also heard more details about the search for her. Nathaniel had finally emerged from his humiliation enough to offer a reward, $100 for information leading to her capture, and descriptions of her were being circulated. The descriptions were more detailed now, including her approximate age and height, the fact that she could read numbers if not letters, that she had worked as a house servant and might try to find similar work. Wanted posters would soon be printed and distributed, her face committed to paper for every constable and slave catcher to study. On the fourth day after the storm, Phoebe made a decision. She had heard that a merchant ship called the Meridian was preparing to sail for Baltimore in 2 days, and that the captain was taking on additional crew and passengers to replace those who had been injured in the storm, or who had decided they wanted no more of the sea after such a harrowing experience. Baltimore was a border city, not truly north but not as deeply south as Charleston, and from there she might be able to find passage further north or disappear into the free black community that existed there in greater numbers than in Charleston. The risk was enormous. She would need to approach the ship and convince someone to take her aboard, either as paying passenger or as crew, without arousing suspicion that she was a runaway. She would need papers or a plausible story about why she did not have papers, or enough money to make someone willing to overlook such details. And she would need to do all of this without being recognized from the descriptions that were now circulating throughout the port district. Phoebe used some of Nathaniel's money to purchase different clothing from the relief donations at the church, selecting garments that made her look more like a working woman than a house servant. She acquired a bonnet that shadowed her face and made her features less distinct. She practiced a slight limp, thinking it might alter her silhouette enough to create doubt in anyone comparing her to the descriptions. She created a story about being a free woman whose papers had been lost in the storm, who needed to travel to Baltimore to stay with family there after losing everything in Charleston. On the evening before the Meridian was scheduled to depart, Phoebe made her way to the waterfront. The port had recovered remarkably quickly from the storm damage, with crews working around the clock to clear debris and make repairs. Ships were once again loading cargo and passengers, the normal rhythms of commerce reasserting themselves with the resilience that characterized coastal cities accustomed to weathering hurricanes and tempests. She found the Meridian, a mid-sized merchant vessel that looked sturdy if not particularly impressive, and she observed it from a distance for some time, watching the crew at work, studying the captain when he emerged from below decks to supervise loading operations. As twilight deepened, Phoebe approached the ship, her heart pounding so hard she felt lightheaded. She climbed the gangplank with as much confidence as she could project and asked to speak with the captain about passage to Baltimore. A crew member regarded her suspiciously for a moment before going to fetch the captain, leaving Phoebe standing on the deck trying not to look as terrified as she felt. The captain, a weathered man of perhaps 50 with sun-damaged skin and intelligent eyes, emerged and asked what she wanted. Phoebe launched into her prepared story, explaining that she was a free woman who had lost her papers in the storm, that she needed to reach Baltimore where she had family, that she had money to pay for passage and was willing to work during the voyage if that would reduce the cost. She kept her voice steady and met his eyes directly, projecting a confidence she did not feel, praying that he would see a woman in difficult circumstances rather than a piece of stolen property. The captain studied her for a long moment, and Phoebe could not read his expression. He asked where her family was in Baltimore, what work she had done in Charleston, how much money she had for passage. She answered each question, elaborating on her fabricated story, adding details that made it seem more real. He listened without comment, then finally said that passage to Baltimore would cost $40, payable in advance, and that she would be expected to help in the galley during the voyage if she wanted to earn any of that money back through labor. Phoebe agreed immediately, pulling out the money with hands that shook only slightly, counting out the bills while the captain watched. He took the money and told her to be aboard by dawn, that they would be sailing with the morning tide. He added, almost as an afterthought, that he did not concern himself overmuch with the business of other people, that he ran a merchant ship and not an inquiry office, but that if any trouble followed her to his vessel, he would put her off at the nearest port without refund. The message was clear. He suspected she might be running from something, but as long as it did not interfere with his business, he was willing to look the other way. Phoebe thanked him and left the ship, walking quickly back toward the church before her legs could give out from sheer relief. She had done it, had secured passage out of Charleston, had moved one crucial step closer to something that might eventually become freedom. But she also knew that the most dangerous moment still lay ahead, the hours between now and dawn when she would need to make her way back to the ship and board without being intercepted. The voyage itself, when any number of things might go wrong. The arrival in Baltimore, where she would be friendless and vulnerable in a new city. She spent her last night in Charleston in the church basement, lying awake while others slept around her, listening to the breathing of strangers and thinking about everything she was leaving behind. She thought about Marcus, wondering if he had been punished for her escape, hoping he understood why she had not said goodbye. She thought about her mother and sisters scattered to places she would likely never know, and sent a silent prayer into the universe that they were surviving, that they might someday be free. She thought about Nathaniel Greene, locked in his cellar, and felt no guilt whatsoever for what she had done. If anything, she wished she could have done more, wished she could have struck a blow against the entire system rather than just one man. But she had done what she could with the tools and opportunities available to her, and that would have to be enough. She had refused to be broken, had chosen danger and uncertainty over submission, had locked the cellar door and walked away into a storm that should have killed her but somehow had not. Whether that made her brave or foolish or simply desperate, she did not know, and did not particularly care. She was still alive, still moving forward, still fighting, and that was its own kind of victory even if the war was far from won. Before dawn, Phoebe rose from her pallet and gathered her small bundle of possessions. She left the church quietly, not saying goodbye to anyone because goodbyes created memories and memories could be dangerous. She walked through the dark streets of Charleston one last time, moving past houses where enslaved people were already awake and beginning their endless labor, past churches and markets and grand homes built on the wealth extracted from human suffering. She committed it all to memory, not because she wanted to remember, but because she wanted to never forget what she had survived, what she had escaped, what still needed to be torn down and remade. She reached the waterfront just as the sky was beginning to lighten in the east, that gray pre-dawn moment when the world is colorless and unclear. The Meridian was alive with activity, crew members preparing to cast off, cargo being loaded in final batches, passengers beginning to arrive. Phoebe climbed the gangplank for the second time, and this time no one questioned her right to be there. She was just another passenger, anonymous in the bustle of departure, already fading into the background the way she had learned to do throughout her life. As the sun rose, the Meridian cast off its mooring lines and began moving away from the dock. Phoebe stood at the rail, watching Charleston recede, the city's distinctive skyline of church steeples and grand houses growing smaller and less distinct with each passing minute. She felt no nostalgia for the place, only a profound relief at leaving it behind. The harbor water was calm after the storm, reflecting the pink and gold of sunrise, and seabirds wheeled overhead calling to each other in voices that sounded like celebration or warning, or both. The voyage to Baltimore took 6 days, during which Phoebe worked in the galley as promised, helping prepare meals for crew and passengers, cleaning pots and dishes, staying busy and keeping her head down. She spoke little to the other passengers, most of whom were merchants or travelers who had no particular interest in the story of a free black woman traveling alone. The crew treated her with indifference, neither friendly nor hostile, simply accepting her presence as one more element in the ship's functioning ecosystem. On the third day out from Charleston, a passenger asked Phoebe if she had heard about the slave woman who had locked her master in his cellar during the storm. The passenger, a merchant who dealt in cotton futures, thought it was both appalling and somehow amusing. A story he was clearly planning to dine out on when he returned to his home in Philadelphia. He wanted to know what Phoebe thought of such behavior, whether she believed the woman would be caught, what should be done with her if she was. Phoebe kept her face carefully neutral and said she supposed the woman must have been desperate. That people did desperate things when pushed far enough, that she had no opinion on what should be done because such matters were above her concern. The merchant seemed satisfied with this response, nodded and moved on to other topics, and Phoebe returned to her work with her heart racing, realizing how thin her disguise really was, how easily everything could still collapse. But the voyage continued without incident, and on the morning of the 6th day, Baltimore came into view. It was a larger city than Charleston, more industrial, with a different energy and rhythm. The harbor was crowded with ships of all sizes, and the waterfront was a chaos of activity that made Charleston's port seem almost leisurely by comparison. Phoebe watched the city approach with mixed feelings, knowing that arrival represented both opportunity and danger, that she would need to navigate a completely unfamiliar place with no resources beyond the money remaining from what she had taken from Nathaniel's desk and her own intelligence and determination. The Meridian docked in mid-morning and passengers began disembarking. Phoebe waited until most of the others had left before gathering her bundle and walking down the gangplank into Baltimore. She had no clear plan beyond survival. No contacts or connections, no safe place to go. But she had made it this far against odds that should have been insurmountable, and she refused to believe that the universe had brought her this distance only to let her fail now. She spent the first few days in Baltimore learning the city, walking its streets and observing its rhythms, identifying the neighborhoods where free black people lived and worked. She found a boarding house run by a free black woman who was willing to rent her a tiny room on a weekly basis. No questions asked about papers or background as long as the rent was paid on time. She found work cleaning houses for several white families, work that paid poorly but provided enough to cover her basic expenses while she figured out her next steps. Baltimore was different from Charleston in ways both obvious and subtle. The free black community was larger and more established, with churches and social organizations and businesses that created a degree of independence from white control. But slavery was still legal in Maryland, and the city was full of slave catchers and informants who made their living capturing runaways and returning them to their owners. Phoebe lived in constant fear that she would be recognized, that someone would connect her to the descriptions that had surely been circulated, that Nathaniel Greene would have extended his search beyond Charleston to port cities where a runaway might have fled. She changed her name, began calling herself Sarah Wade, created a new history for herself as a woman who had been born free in Delaware and had come to Baltimore looking for work after her husband died. She altered her appearance as much as she could, cutting her hair shorter, acquiring different clothing, practicing a slightly different way of speaking and moving. She became someone else, or at least tried to, though she carried Phoebe Carter inside her like a secret that could destroy her if revealed. Weeks turned into months, and the immediate terror of being caught gradually subsided into a kind of chronic wariness that became her new normal. She heard occasional news from Charleston through the networks of communication that existed among free black communities. Stories and gossip and information that traveled faster than anyone might expect. She learned that Nathaniel Greene had eventually offered a larger reward for her capture, $200 and that descriptions of her had been widely circulated. She learned that Marcus had been questioned extensively about her escape, but had convincingly claimed to know nothing, and that he had not been punished beyond the standard suspicion that fell on any enslaved person connected, however tangentially, to a runaway. She also learned through sources that were unclear and possibly unreliable that Nathaniel Greene had not brought her sister to Charleston after all, that the entire negotiation had been a fiction designed to manipulate her into compliance. She wanted to be surprised by this revelation, but she was not. She had always suspected as much, had known on some level that a man like Nathaniel Greene would use any tool available to control those in his power, including inventing hope where none existed. The confirmation of his deception made her hate him even more, if such a thing was possible. But it also relieved one of the guilt she had carried, the fear that her escape might have doomed her sister to some terrible fate. In the spring of 1843, more than a year after her escape, Phoebe, who now answered only to Sarah, heard that Nathaniel Greene had died. The details were sketchy, but apparently he had suffered some kind of seizure or stroke while at his office, had collapsed and died before a doctor could be summoned. The news affected her in unexpected ways, bringing not celebration but a strange emptiness, as though the defining conflict of her life had been resolved in a manner that felt incomplete and unsatisfying. She had not wanted him to simply die. She had wanted him to face consequences for his actions, to understand what he had done, to reckon with the suffering he had caused. But the universe did not provide such tidy endings, and she was left to make peace with the knowledge that he had escaped any real accountability. With Nathaniel's death, the reward for her capture was presumably voided, though Phoebe was not naive enough to believe that meant she was safe. She was still technically property, still subject to enslavement if anyone discovered her true status, still vulnerable to the Fugitive Slave Act that allowed runaways to be captured even in free states and returned to bondage. But the immediate personal threat had diminished, and she could breathe slightly easier knowing that Nathaniel Greene was no longer actively hunting for her. She continued her life in Baltimore, working and surviving, slowly building a small community of friends and acquaintances who knew her only as Sarah Wade. She attended a church where the congregation included both free and enslaved black people, where the sermons contained coded messages about resistance and endurance that anyone who needed to hear them understood perfectly. She befriended other women who had their own stories of escape and survival, though they rarely shared details that might be used against them if circumstances changed. They looked out for each other in small ways, sharing information about which employers were trustworthy, which neighborhoods were safer, which white people might be sympathetic to their causes and which were dangerous. Years passed, and Phoebe built a life that was not freedom in any complete sense, but was infinitely better than what she had left behind. She never married, never had children, never stayed in one place long enough to put down deep roots. She moved from Baltimore to Philadelphia to New York, always keeping one step ahead of any questions that got too specific, any interests that seemed too pointed. She worked as a domestic servant, a laundress, a cook, using skills she had developed in bondage to sustain herself in a precarious sort of liberty. She heard through the networks that connected black communities across the North occasional stories about a slave woman who had locked her master in a cellar during a terrible storm and disappeared, leaving only her headscarf behind. The story had become almost legendary in certain circles, retold and embellished until it bore only passing resemblance to what had actually happened. In some versions, Phoebe had murdered Nathaniel Greene before escaping. In others, she had stolen a ship and sailed it single-handedly to freedom. In still others, she had been helped by a network of abolitionists who spirited her away to Canada. The truth, as is often the case, was both less dramatic and more complicated than the legends that grew up around it. Phoebe never corrected these stories when she heard them. She never claimed the legend as her own, never revealed that she was the woman people spoke about in hushed, admiring tones. But she listened to the stories and felt a complicated mixture of emotions. Pride that her act had inspired others, sadness that it had to be spoken of in whispers rather than celebrated openly, anger that the world required such desperate measures, hope that maybe her small rebellion had meant something beyond her personal survival. The years leading up to the Civil War were tense and strange, with the nation fragmenting along lines everyone could see but no one seemed able to prevent. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 made life even more dangerous for people like Phoebe, eliminating many of the protections that had previously existed in free states. She heard stories of people who had lived as free in the North for years or even decades being captured and dragged back south, of children born free being claimed as slaves, of trials that were farces and justice that was non-existent. She became even more cautious, even more careful about who she trusted and what she revealed. When the war finally came in 1861, Phoebe was living in New York City, working as a laundress and living in a tiny apartment in a neighborhood where many free black people had settled. She watched the conflict unfold with complicated feelings, hoping that it might finally destroy the institution of slavery, but fearing what might happen to the millions of enslaved people caught in the middle of a war they had not asked for and could not control. She read newspaper accounts when she could get access to them, heard stories from soldiers returning from the front, tried to understand what it might mean if the Union won, what kind of freedom might emerge from such catastrophic violence. The Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 represented a turning point, though Phoebe understood enough about politics to know it was as much a war measure as a moral statement. Still, it was something, a crack in the foundation of the slave system that might eventually bring the whole structure down. She allowed herself to hope carefully, guardedly, that maybe the world was finally changing in a direction that might lead to something resembling justice. The war ended in 1865, and the 13th Amendment abolished slavery throughout the United States. Phoebe was 49 years old, had been living as a fugitive for 23 years, and suddenly the legal basis for her fugitive status no longer existed. She was free. Actually legally free, not because anyone had granted her freedom, but because the institution that had claimed ownership over her had been destroyed. The feeling was surreal, almost incomprehensible, like waking from a nightmare that had lasted decades, only to discover the waking world was strange and unfamiliar. But freedom, Phoebe discovered, was more complicated than she had imagined during all those years of running and hiding. The end of slavery did not mean the end of racism or discrimination or violence against black people. It did not mean safety or security or justice. It simply meant that the most brutal and explicit form of oppression had been replaced with others that were less obvious but still profoundly limiting. Former slave owners found ways to recreate bondage through sharecropping and convict leasing and black codes that criminalized ordinary behavior. The promise of reconstruction gave way to betrayal and abandonment, and the brief moment when real change seemed possible slipped away like water through desperate fingers. Phoebe lived through all of this, watching history unfold, surviving into her 70s when most people born into slavery never lived past their 50s. She never returned to Charleston, never tried to find her sisters or mother or Marcus. Knowing that the chances of success were vanishingly small and the emotional cost might be more than she could bear. She carried them with her always, though, kept them alive in memory even when she had to accept that they were likely dead in reality. She told herself that her survival, her refusal to be broken, honored them in some small way, that by living she bore witness to their existence and their suffering. In her later years, Phoebe, who had been Sarah Wade for so long that she sometimes forgot her original name, began to think about legacy, about what would remain when she was gone. She had no children to remember her, no wealth to pass on, no public achievements that anyone would commemorate. But she had lived, had fought, had refused to accept what the world tried to tell her about who and what she was. She had locked a cellar door and walked into a storm and survived when survival should have been impossible. That was something. Maybe it was enough. She died in New York in 1897 at the age of 81, in a small room in a building that would be torn down less than a year later to make way for new construction. She died alone as she had lived for most of her adult life, without family present or fanfare or anyone to note her passing with more than passing regret. Her few possessions were distributed among her neighbors, most of whom knew her only as an old woman who had worked hard and kept to herself and occasionally told stories about the old days that might or might not have been true. But the story of Phoebe Carter, the woman who locked her master in his cellar and disappeared into a storm forever, continued to circulate among black communities in the South and the North. It became part of the oral tradition of resistance, one of thousands of stories about people who had refused to submit, who had fought back in whatever ways were available to them, who had insisted on their humanity in a world determined to deny it. The details became increasingly disconnected from reality over the decades, but the essential truth remained. Someone had said no. Someone had taken control of their own fate even when the cost was unimaginable. Someone had survived. In Charleston, the Greene house on Meeting Street continued to stand long after Nathaniel Greene died, and long after the war ended. It changed hands multiple times, was converted from a private residence to a boarding house to offices to eventually a museum. Tour guides told visitors about the famous families who had lived there, about the architecture and the furniture and the role the building had played in Charleston's history. Sometimes in later years, when such things became acknowledged, guides would mention that the house had once been the site of an incident involving an enslaved woman who locked her owner in the cellar, though details were scarce, and the story was treated as an amusing historical footnote rather than the profound act of resistance and desperation it had been. The cellar itself remained largely unchanged, still accessed through the same heavy oak door at the top of stone steps, still lined with wine racks and storage shelves. Preservation societies debated over the years whether the chains mounted to the wall in one corner should be removed or kept as evidence of the building's full history, eventually deciding to keep them with explanatory plaques that acknowledged the violence inherent in the slaveholding household. But no plaque mentioned Phoebe Carter by name. No marker identified her as the woman whose courage and rage had once filled that space before she walked away from it forever. There were occasional reports over the years of strange occurrences in the house. People claimed to hear footsteps in the cellar when no one was down there, to smell smoke from candles that were not lit, to feel sudden drops in temperature that had no obvious source. Some said these were the manifestations of Nathaniel Greene's spirit, forever trapped in the space where he had been humiliated. But others, those who knew the deeper story or who felt things that reason could not explain, believed it was Phoebe's presence that lingered there, not haunting the place but rather marking it, claiming it as the site of her transformation from property to person, from victim to agent of her own destiny. The blue headscarf that Phoebe had left tied to the cellar key was preserved, though whether by accident or intention was never clear. It passed through various hands over the decades, sometimes displayed as a curiosity, sometimes packed away and forgotten, always carrying with it the story of the woman who had worn it. In the 1960s and 70s, during the civil rights movement, when people began looking at history through different lenses and asking different questions, The headscarf was rediscovered and recognized for what it truly was. A relic of resistance, a symbol of refusal, a reminder that enslaved people had never accepted their enslavement passively, but had fought back in countless ways, both large and small. Historians began researching Phoebe's story more seriously, though the documentary evidence was frustratingly sparse. They found records of her purchase, descriptions in newspapers from the period about the incident and the search for her, a few tantalizing references in letters and diaries kept by Charleston residents. But Phoebe herself remained elusive. Her life after escape a mystery that could not be conclusively solved. Some researchers believed they had traced her to Baltimore and then north, connecting Sarah Wade to Phoebe Carter through circumstantial evidence and timeline analysis. Others argued that she could not have survived more than a few months on the run, that she must have died during the storm or shortly after, that the sightings and stories were wishful thinking rather than historical fact. The truth, as Phoebe would have appreciated, remained just out of reach, protected by the same secrecy and caution that had allowed her to survive. She had learned early that revealing too much was dangerous, that the less people knew, the safer you were, and she had carried that lesson with her until the end. Whether she lived a long life or a short one, whether she found something resembling happiness or merely endured until death released her, whether she ever regretted locking that cellar door or only wished she could have done more, these things remained her own, private and unrecorded, and therefore safe from appropriation or distortion. What could not be disputed, what remained as solid fact across the centuries now, was that on a March night in 1842, during a storm that would be remembered as one of the most violent to ever strike Charleston, an enslaved woman named Phoebe Carter made a choice that changed everything. She refused the future that Nathaniel Greene had planned for her, locked him away from the world he thought he controlled, and walked out into chaos and uncertainty rather than submit to one more moment of violation. She left behind only a headscarf and a mystery, and in doing so became something more than a person. She became an idea, a story, a light in the darkness for others who needed to believe that resistance was possible. The storm that carried Phoebe away from Charleston eventually dissipated over the inland regions of South Carolina, its fury spent, its destruction complete. But storms of a different sort were building across the nation, conflicts over slavery and freedom and what it meant to be human, tensions that would eventually erupt into civil war and transformation. Phoebe did not cause those storms any more than she caused the weather that night in March. But she was part of them, one of thousands of people whose individual acts of resistance created the conditions for larger change, whose refusal to accept injustice as permanent and unchangeable helped crack the foundations of an evil system. And perhaps that is the truest legacy of Phoebe Carter. Not that she escaped or survived or disappeared, but that she refused. She refused to be broken, refused to accept what the world told her about her own worthlessness, refused to let Nathaniel Greene or anyone else define the limits of her humanity. She locked the cellar door and walked into the storm, and in doing so she demonstrated what enslaved people had always known, but what their oppressors could never admit, that no amount of violence or law or custom could truly make one human being the property of another, that the spirit could not be chained no matter how thoroughly the body was bound, that freedom was not something that could be granted or withheld, but was instead an essential quality of being human, inalienable and eternal and worth any price to defend. The cellar door in the greenhouse on Meeting Street still stands, still opens onto those stone steps leading down into darkness. The lock has been replaced many times over the years, but it still requires a heavy key to open and close it. Still makes the same solid sound when the bolt slides home. And sometimes late at night when the museum is closed and the building is empty, There are those who claim they can still hear the echo of that sound, the finality of it, the moment when everything changed and nothing could ever be the same again, the instant when Phoebe Carter locked the door and became forever free.